کریس الکساندر، سفیر پیشین دولت کانادا در افغانستان، مرد قاطع و مصمم، آن چی گفت عمل کرد. کریس الکساندر در بخش ملل متحد مصدر خدمات زیاده برای کشور ما شد. کریس الکساندر بعداً در منطقه ایجکس به حیث وکیل پارلمان انتخاب شد و به پارلمان کانادا راه پیدا کرد. الکساندر بعداً به حیث وزیر امیگریشن کانادا کار خودش شروع کرد و تغییرات زیاده در بخش امیگریشن وارد کردن که واقعا تا امروز خدماتشان قابل قدر است. ما خوشحال هستیم که امروز آقای کریس الکساندر با خود داریم و در همراهی با آقای انجیل حکیم ناظم. سلام آقای کریس الکساندر، خوشحال هستیم که شما را با خود داریم.
تشکر. سلام علیکم. بسیار خوشحال هستم که من برای شما هستم. وزیر مهاجرت بودم.
بله.
در دولت کانادا. بعد از او در افغانستان 6 سال زندگی کردم. بسیار خوشحال هستم که
تشکر. انجینیر صاحب سلام برای شما تقدیم میکنم.
سلام علیکم. I would like to welcome Honorable Chris Alexander, former United Nations Deputy Mission for Afghanistan, former Canadian Ambassador to Kabul, Afghanistan, a writer, a former diplomat, writer of a famous book, The Long Way Back, Afghanistan Quest for Peace, and also the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Canada. Welcome to our show, Mr. Alexander.
تشکر میکنم از آقای کریس الکساندر و تشکر میکنم از آقای انجینیر حکیم ناظم. بده گرامی، من هم دوست دارم که بیننده ایت مصاحبه باشم. آقای انجینیر حکیم ناظم مصاحبه را پیش میبرن. من فیسبوک چک میکنم، اگر شما پیام داشتین، سوال داشتین، من سوالای شما را انتقال میدم. جناب انجینیر شما مهربانی کنین.
So once again I welcome you. Chris, is it okay if I call you Chris? Yeah.
Of course.
So you can call me
Great to
Hakeem.
be with you. With these two distinguished gentlemen, I feel underdressed.
It is a pleasure to have you here to answer for so many unanswered questions. I have already received so many pages of questions from the people since yesterday Mr. Khaled announced that we will have an interview. So hopefully we will have enough time to go through all of this. Let's start from the book. Almost a decade ago, you wrote about the history of Afghanistan. You wrote about peace, and people want to know that today, while we are talking, is there a deliverable blueprint for transforming the troubled country into a viable nation, have some peace and stability for the people of Afghanistan?
Fantastic question. I mean, yes, there is. I think there have been a huge number of very important plans put forward for Afghanistan's economy, for Afghan society, for education, for health in Afghanistan, for regional cooperation, which so many people, so many Afghan leaders and business people and entrepreneurs speak about enthusiastically because of Afghanistan's crucial position in the heart of Asia, in Central Asia, South Asia, connecting all regions of Asia. But the real answer to your question is simple. There can't be much progress on these issues until the war ends. And that has to mean an end to proxy war, to cross-border war, to interference in Afghanistan from a neighboring country, yes, by the Taliban, but by the Taliban and other groups who are acting in the name of and under the direction of another country, namely Pakistan. So when I published that book in the fall of 2011, I was quite optimistic because Osama bin Laden had just been found a couple of months ago living outside of Abbottabad. I hoped at that time that there would be a rapid reckoning with Pakistan to ensure that the proxy war ended. As we now know, that did not happen. And in a sense, we've had 10 lost years of drift and uneven progress, even backsliding on some of the plans that Afghans have for their country. So that has been sad to watch, but it is never too late to do the right thing. And in addition, these are difficult issues. These are not issues that began in the 21st century. This is a war, a policy that Pakistan inherited from the British, from the Raj, and that has even deeper roots than that, which needs to be ended, changed, definitively put on the shelf so that both countries can live in peace and move forward, and so that Afghans can implement their plans.
So, talking about the proxy war, do you think that the number of aggressors in the proxy war has extended, or you think Pakistan is the only country who's involved in the proxy war?
No, I mean, one would be naive to say that there's only one player. Obviously, the focus for the last 20 years has been mostly on the US and NATO allies, what they have done right, what they have done wrong. And there's a mixed legacy there, let's be honest. But they are withdrawing now, except for very small contingent that will protect embassies and airports and so forth. And so the focus is now on why is the war continuing? And yes, it's because of the Taliban. Yes, it's because of the Haqqani group, Daesh, Dar Khorasan, or whatever you wish to call them, and these other break-off groups, including splinter groups of the Taliban, who are fighting the Afghan government. Most of their support comes from Pakistan, there's no question. Some of the Taliban leaders, commanders, we know, because they were uncomfortable being dependent on Pakistan, have tried to find support elsewhere. We know famously that Mullah Mansour, who is now no longer with us, who was taken out in a drone strike, was actively seeking the support of Iran. And Iran has played a smaller role with the Taliban, supporting them, particularly in the west and southwest of the country. But this is relatively insignificant compared to Pakistan's role.
Yeah. Mr. Alexander, do you think that the Taliban found greater support by signing a deal with the United States about a year and a few months back on February 29, 2020, by Mr. Khalilzad saying publicly that we asked the United Kingdom to help us coordinate with Pakistan in taking over the management of war and peace in Afghanistan. So, and with some other nations getting involved, supporting Taliban, do you think that Taliban get more lucky, getting more support than what we were expecting at the beginning?
I think that negotiation, US directly with the Taliban, was a mistake. The Afghan government, in my view, should never have been left out of the equation. And yes, there has been a danger, I think, for over a decade of giving too much credibility to a group that really, by any normal standard, would be considered terrorists. They are listed as terrorists, as a terrorist organization in Canada, and war criminals because of their attacks on civilian targets, like the Dashti Barchi bombings, which of course haven't been proven to be linked to the Taliban. But there are countless such attacks in the past, sometimes involving suicide attackers, sometimes involving remotely detonated devices against civilians that would qualify as war crimes under any normal assessment of what the Taliban has been doing. So when a group is dedicated to violence, is committing war crimes, is committing atrocities almost every day, is targeting civilians, they do not deserve international recognition in any way. And in fact, their political role in Afghanistan, if they ever have one, will only begin after a ceasefire is implemented. And of course, that hasn't happened. So yes, somewhat excessive credibility has been given to them. But at the same time, let's be honest, they are under scrutiny as well. They are now known to be operating from Pakistan. They go back from Doha to consult their masters, some of whom are senior Taliban commanders, some of whom are Pakistani military officers. They are increasingly seen as agents, tools in a proxy war. And that isn't going to help their credibility either in the eyes of Afghans or in the eyes of anyone else in the world, because we are starting to wake up to the danger of proxy wars in the 21st century. Iran has been prosecuting proxy wars. Russia has been invading and occupying parts of Ukraine in a strategy that can be described as proxy war as well. Also involves regular Russian troops. These are dangerous strategies that are threats to international peace and security.
We'll come back to that strategy, but the one thing that I want to bring up here is, while the United Nations, United States, Canada, and other NATO countries are collecting evidence and trying to know better the Taliban, do you think the suffering of the people of Afghanistan is going to continue? Is any way that we can stop the killing and the suffering of people before the CIA and the world know better Taliban?
Well, let's be honest. Documentation of crimes is very hard from the distance most of us are operating. We cannot leave this conflict to those who've been responsible up until now, because they haven't done a very good job of ending it. Now is the time for people who haven't been involved, who consider themselves just ordinary citizens, to get involved, because the biggest impact we can have is by raising our voices to demand political action. And what should that action be? In my view, it should be sanctions against those supporting the Taliban, those supporting the continuing violence, and those supporters are mostly in Pakistan.
Well, talking about raising voices, you were the UN Deputy Commissioner in Kabul, Afghanistan. Then you are the ambassador of Canada in Afghanistan. And I'm sure you are in touch with the United Nations, with the UK, US, and other NATO countries' representatives in Kabul. What was the reaction of the US diplomats at that time that you raised the concerns and questions about the Taliban and Taliban supporters and the countries, including or mainly Pakistan, who was paying the bills and providing everything for this war? What was their reaction? What was the reaction of Prime Minister Steve Harper at that time back at home? So what happened? Is there anything that people should know that happened on that time?
Sure. I mean, there's been an evolution. Back in 2003, 4, 5, when I first arrived in Afghanistan, when I and others, especially Afghan friends and colleagues, would raise these issues, there was denial. US partners, British partners, UN colleagues would all say, no, that may have been the case in the past, Chris. Pakistan supported the Taliban. There's a lot of bad blood because of that, but it's not happening now, and we're sure.
I remember when I was in Kabul at that time working for NATO ISAF, Prime Minister Steve Harper sent a delegation led by former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley, and we had a few meetings in Kabul. Then when the delegation come back, actually the only outcome was the withdrawal of some of the Canadian forces from the battlefield to the training camps in Kabul. That was the only outcome. Correct me please if I am wrong. So it means that
you're right.
Canada for a long time, the conservative and our liberal colleagues, they have decided not to worry too much about the war in Afghanistan. They are busy, while Canada has a name for peacekeeping and peacemaking around the world. So why is this? People want to know why a great country such as Canada, which has a lot of similarities with the people of Afghanistan, is not supporting the peace process in a more aggressive way. Please.
Well, let's be clear. A Liberal government sent Canadian troops to Afghanistan. That was a groundbreaking move because a lot of other countries, NATO members, followed our example. And that may have prevented a Taliban military takeover from happening at that early stage, 10 or 15 years ago. Stephen Harper, while I was still in Afghanistan, Stephen Harper and his conservative government were in office when we were actually fighting in Kandahar and leading the fight in the south to prevent the Taliban from regaining control of districts and provincial capitals. And then later, Canada was one of the only countries to list the Taliban as a terrorist group, and we have never changed our view of that under successive conservative and liberal governments. So there has been a position of principle. Canadians want to see peace in Afghanistan. I think Canadian voices have started to speak earlier than others about Pakistan's role. But you're right, we haven't been coherent, just as the US hasn't been coherent. We haven't treated Pakistan in the wake of its continuing proxy war in Afghanistan the same way we treated Putin's Russia after they invaded Ukraine. And that is a double standard. And the same consistent standard should be applied across the board. And that's why I strongly believe those countries invading, destabilizing, waging proxy war in neighboring countries or other countries should face sanctions. And you're right, no country has yet done this. But since my report this year came out in February, I have not had a single friend, colleague, contact tell me that this is not the right approach. On the contrary, many people have said, Chris, we may not have agreed with you earlier. We may not have seen the urgency of this earlier. Now it has to happen. A lot of people spent 10 years hoping that negotiations with the Taliban would bring about a ceasefire and a peace settlement. That has not happened. And I think anyone who thinks that it's going to happen without pressure, without an overwhelming display of diplomatic force is kidding themselves.
Yes. So I remember 10 years ago, there was a Istanbul conference. There was a 6+2. I think you talked about it somewhere. I don't remember, but I remember, I think you were introducing the book or you're talking in a panel. You mentioned something about that. So here we are again, hoping to have another Istanbul conference. This time, United States is pushing for UN to lead this conference. And UK and Pakistan, is pushing that Pakistan be more responsible or as a coordinator of peace deal between Kabul regime and Taliban. The Taliban is looking for Fatah or victory. They are saying everybody should surrender to us. Yeah, the diplomats will be safe, the civilians will be safe, the military surrender their weapons. This is exactly not what everybody wants to see. Nobody wants to see a surrender to Taliban and a return of Emirate. So where we go from here? Istanbul conference, today I hear the Taliban is saying we are coming under these conditions. If you do this, if you do this, if the conference is 3 days, if there's no decision made on that one, if we are not forced to take any action. So where we go, you are insisting on a more aggressive diplomatic approach. How are we going to do that?
Well,
Any advice?
I think we've started to move in this direction. Even a few months ago, there was a lot of talk of making more concessions, releasing more prisoners, being somehow more accommodating of the Taliban. I think today that discussion is over. They have achieved the withdrawal of US troops. They have achieved the release of most of their prisoners. They have achieved a dialogue both with the United States and with the Afghan government, and an offer of serious power sharing, which would be guaranteed by the whole international community. And still, they're unwilling not only to implement a ceasefire, but to reduce violence. That says to me that there is no good faith. That says to me what I've always suspected, that the Taliban don't actually control their own decision-making, that they don't make their own decisions. Those decisions are made for them in ISI, in general headquarters, and ultimately by General Bajwa. And so what does one do in the face of a lack of good faith? You have to step back and look at other options. And one thing that has happened in the past month is that both Ashraf Ghani and Zalmay Khalilzad have spoken, one to Der Spiegel, the other in testimony to Congress, in congressional committee hearings in Washington, have spoken in terms of a proxy war by Pakistan. There is agreement now that that is the real challenge, that the ball is in Pakistan's court, and that if a reduction in violence or ceasefire are not delivered, then there have to be consequences for Pakistan, for Pakistan's stature in the world, for their level of engagement with partners near and far. And it is, in fact, Pakistan's credibility that's on the line. And Pakistan is not a country that has a lot of options these days. They are losing strategic ground to India every day. Their economy is extremely weak. They are stumbling from IMF program to IMF program. They had loans called in by Saudi Arabia recently. They are being bailed out by China, but China is not terribly keen on a country that is the main sponsor of Sunni terrorism in the world today.
So Pakistan has all these troubles, but still Pakistan wants to support Taliban. Still Pakistan does not want to end up with a deal that everybody else is happy and not Pakistan. What is exactly that Pakistan is looking for from this 43 years or more of war in Afghanistan? Do we have a clear idea of the demands that Pakistan has from Afghanistan and from the United States and allies?
No, I think they are totally without a vision of what they want. They are basically going on inertia, on the old habit, the bad habit of pursuing military advantage in Afghanistan because it translates into something they called at one time strategic depth. And what was strategic depth? It was really a psychological compensation for generals who were traumatized by the loss of East Pakistan in 1971 and decided that interfering on their western borders with Afghanistan would somehow restore Pakistan's prestige and influence. And through the 1980s, when they had this special partnership with the United States to support Hizb Islami, to support Jamiat Islami and other groups to eject the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, that policy looked like it was having some success, at least from the general's perspective. When the partnership ended in 1989, they created Al-Qaeda, they jumped on the Taliban bandwagon, and ultimately put the Taliban in power for 5 years when the whole world was ignoring the region. But the legacy of this strategic depth policy is really the following. It is devastation through the period of jihad, perhaps 1 million victims, a terrible civil war with even more victims, and all the refugee flows that we know so well, followed by the Taliban regime, which was one of the most regressive in recent world history, followed by these 20 years of proxy war against an effort to rebuild Afghanistan that had the support of the whole world. So Pakistan has, on one hand, been supporting the reconstruction of Afghanistan. All of its leaders have said they want peace and stability in Afghanistan. They've even contributed funds to rebuild infrastructure in Afghanistan and so forth. But with the other hand, they have been supporting this proxy war, which only leads to death, destruction, and more casualties. They have yet to decide what comes next. They're just doing what they have always done because this is what armies, particularly the covert, clandestine sides of military and security agencies do. They follow orders, and those orders haven't really changed in 40 years.
So the Pakistanis always say, they are not hiding it, they are not shy to say that we are sandwiched between India and Afghanistan. They are saying a friendly government in Kabul towards India is a danger to our stability and sovereignty. Do you think there's some value to this claim?
Well, point me towards a capital anywhere in the world that is not friendly to India today. India has a stronger alliance than it's ever had in the Gulf. All the Gulf states, from Saudi Arabia to UAE to Kuwait, Bahrain, even Qatar. India is a partner of Iran. The United States doesn't necessarily like that, but they are a strong partner, and they have a trading relationship that is of mutual benefit. I cannot point to a single capital anywhere in the world that is hostile to India today other than Beijing. And if the Pakistani authorities, military and civilian, think that somehow they're going to install a government in Afghanistan that is hostile to India and obedient only to Beijing, I think they are dreaming. I think this is absolutely impossible. I don't think Afghans would stand for it. I don't think Afghans would choose it. And most of the Muslim world is extremely positive about India these days, which after all has a huge Muslim population as well. So Pakistan is missing the boat on these issues. And power sharing may be an option in the short term in Afghanistan on if the current negotiations succeed. But the Taliban are very unlikely to be chosen by Afghans in an election. And so I think what Pakistan's military is most afraid of is not India or foreign influence in Kabul. They're afraid of democracy.
So
Real democracy.
Some Afghans in the past few years, they are saying that a non-aligned Afghanistan, a stable, a peaceful Afghanistan, a country in peace with its neighbors, can be the best option for the region. A country like Switzerland that will have no close ties with any of the neighbors but equal economical relationship with the neighbors. Do you think something like that would be an opportunity for the Afghans to see peace and stability? Do you think it's viable or no?
Absolutely. This is the vision not only of Afghans, this is the vision of Iqbal, the national poet of Pakistan. This is the vision of anyone who understands Asian history. When Asia has been a leading center of prosperity in the world, which is through most of world history, Afghanistan has been an anchor of those trading relationships, an anchor of education, of learning, of professional achievement, of law. We know this from the history of Afghanistan over thousands of years. And the wars that we've seen in the last 200 years, especially the last 40 years, are the exception to the rule. So that vision is absolutely within reach, but we have to spell it out in specific terms. Who will benefit from this vision? Well, everyone, from China to Iran to Turkey to Russia, and certainly the 6 territorial neighbors of Afghanistan. But who will benefit the most? Pakistan will benefit the most. There is no economy that will be more, that is already more naturally linked by ties of history, geography, trading, commercial links than Afghanistan and Pakistan. And if the war ends, that relationship will not just grow faster, it will take a leap forward. You will see standards of living in the region grow by an extremely large factor in a very short time.
Well, is any main reason or obstacles from our neighbors in the southeast and west, Pakistan and Iran, that will fare from having a non-aligned country? If not, why they are not pushing aggressively to implement such a plan in the next conference in Istanbul, or why they have done nothing in the past few years? Do you think there is something that the Afghans need to know? This is one thing that I appreciate.
I think.
Please go ahead.
I think Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan are all comfortable with the idea of a neutral Afghanistan. China is probably comfortable with that as well. I mean, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are trying to be neutral states in Central Asia themselves. They would love to have the company of a peaceful Afghanistan that was doing the same thing and free of terrorism and so forth. But there was for the last 20 years, there's been an additional goal that those countries, neighboring countries, have shared, which was to rid themselves of an American military presence. You know, that for Iran, and certainly for China, was not a happy situation. So with US forces leaving, a different kind of conversation could happen. And obviously, none of these countries wants the Taliban to come back, even to the level of control they had 1996 to 2001. Certainly not to be the sole rulers of Afghanistan. I don't think there's any danger of that happening. But the discussion about what an Afghanistan without NATO and US troops, without that legacy of the last 20 years can be is really only just beginning now. You know, the only spoiler here is not the Taliban. I mean, they're not particularly strong militarily these days anyway. They're very good at getting their people killed and at intimidating people, but not much else. The only spoiler is Pakistan's military. I mean, what I worry about with these conferences in Istanbul and wherever, Moscow, is that the people there, the Taliban leaders and the Pakistani diplomats and sometimes politicians, are not the real decision makers. The people who need to be held to account are Pakistan's generals. And there are 4 who have led this latest war over 20 years. Musharraf himself, Kayani for a very long time, Raheel Sharif, who is now leading a war on behalf of Saudi Arabia in Yemen, as you know, and the current one, Bajwa. They are the ones that we should all be addressing our appeals to. And you saw him a few days ago in Kabul, answering questions, General Bajwa, about what Pakistan would do, engaging with Abdullah, engaging with Ashraf Ghani. He looked a little bit embarrassed about his own predicament because everyone knows that he's in charge. Everyone knows that he has the power to end this. And the more the pressure grows on him, the more uncomfortable he's going to feel.
Mr. Alexander, there's 2 sides of stories to every thing.
Usually more than 2.
Let's focus on the internal issues. Let's focus on the investment that the world made in the past 20 years on establishing democracy and foundation of peace and democracy in Afghanistan. Do you think the world failed? We have still a government, a corrupt government, a very centralized government. People call it dictatorship. People call it racist. People call it double standard government. Do you think something was gone wrong inside the country while we are focusing fighting terrorism and Taliban in Afghanistan?
Yes, we failed. Not enough was done to stamp out corruption. Enough was done to end abuses by police and tax inspectors and officials all up and down the line. There's no question. But name for me one successful case of building a state that was honest, had integrity, was representative, was balanced, was supportive of minorities and so forth in conditions of war. It doesn't happen. War is incompatible with good governance, certainly with institution building. And so we have failed because the war has continued. And even if we had doubled, tripled, quadrupled our effort, I think we would still have failed unless and until the war is ended, which is why it's astonishing to me that my many Afghan friends and I have been talking about proxy war, Pakistan's role for almost 20 years now. Most of the world thought that the problem in Afghanistan was entirely different, that it was caused by the corruption of Karzai's brother or the Pashtani bank scandal or money being stolen from soldiers' salaries. All of that is horrible and it should have been stopped. But that has not caused, those issues have not caused Afghanistan's failure. The cause of the failure is a proxy war that has been ignored for too long. from the day Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, the world's attention has been on that. And there have been sanctions, and there have been tough political statements at the highest levels. Why shouldn't Pakistan be held to the same standards for a proxy war that has gone on for 20 years, for sheltering Osama bin Laden, who organized the most dramatic and costly terrorist attack in world history? Shouldn't the country that did these things and those who sheltered that person be facing consequences for their actions? We should not hesitate to hold anyone around the world who perpetrates crimes on this scale to account for what they've done.
It is true that mistake was made. Pakistan was ignored and allowed to continue supporting terrorism and Taliban in Afghanistan. But it's equally true that under the eyes of Canadian troops in southern Kandahar, and during the Karzai government, Taliban was supported heavily, largely by Kabul government. And everybody was aware of it. It is true that the ministers who are Canadian citizens who are ministered in the cabinet of Karzai was corrupt, taking money, distributing portion of it to Taliban, and Canadian government and United States and most NATO intelligence were aware of it. But nothing happened from this side also to at least ease the pain and suffering of people of Afghanistan. At least will not provide logistic and accommodation for free for Taliban, who was supported by the enemy of the government. So this is also something that people of Afghanistan, mostly when you talk to them, they say, well, Americans, Canadian, everybody else, NATO is also to be blamed, and this is part of their project. Do you think we also did something wrong on that part that we should admit or try to change it?
Yes, and I have never hesitated to admit the shortcomings of our effort and the mistakes we made from the very beginning. Listen, I spent weeks of my life sitting in rooms with Afghan cabinet ministers, sometimes with the president himself, arguing over who should have jobs in the police, or who should be eligible to be a governor, or who should be in charge of this ulus wali. And these were not decisions for me to make or for anyone in the international community to make, and nor did we ever make them. But we were asked at various points to vet people, to screen people, to give our advice, to say, is someone corrupt? Is someone not corrupt? And it put us in a difficult position, because you couldn't go to a criminal record database and find out what someone had done. You couldn't go to Interpol and ask whether someone was in the opium trade or not. You couldn't check references on people and expect honest answers. So we had to use the information we had, and when we were in the United Nations, it was quite good and usually quite reliable. And for a while, we made progress. Police chiefs were not named who were major drug dealers or hugely corrupt or abusive, practicing torture and so forth. But that influence didn't last for very long. And I also spent many years in Afghanistan trying to ensure that disarmament happened of illegal armed groups, of the old militias that didn't have any status under the new law, so that there could be space for honest police and army institutions to reemerge, because after the civil war and the Taliban regime, they had basically disappeared. Fast forward a few years, the security situation got much worse, and many of these illegal groups, these militias, were reconstituted. And that was a huge step backwards that has contributed, I agree, to corruption and to many problems. But as I say, we have to be careful of arguing too much about the failures of the Kabul government, the corruption in Kabul, because that can very quickly become a welcome mat or a calling card for the Taliban. And I would much rather have the rough, imperfect democracy that Afghanistan has had for 20 years, with schools open for the most part for girls, with some free media, with elections, even though they were highly imperfect, with change of power, which actually happened democratically more than once. I would rather see that than see dictatorship and darkness restored in Kabul. I mean, we're really in a world today where the choice is between, for countries like Afghanistan, is between a highly imperfect democracy and an authoritarian regime where people's choice is taken away from them and where the suffering and the misfortune of everybody grows.
What we have today, the outcome of 20 years of investing on a democracy or democratic society, come with a cost. And right now, we are talking about the full withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, NATO, allies, and basically everybody else. Do you think that the government of Afghanistan will be in a position to continue protecting those democratic gains without any foreign military support, with only receiving?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, on one condition. If the international community takes stronger action, united action, to hold Pakistan to account for a reduction in violence and then ultimately a ceasefire. Look, the Urdu Mili of Afghanistan and other security agencies have been conducting all the combat in the country for over 5 years. Over the past week, they defeated two very strong attacks on Laghman, attempts to divide Kabul from Jalalabad, straight out of the Mujahideen playbook of the 1980s. And I think they have the capacity to defend the Constitution, protect the government, prevent a takeover for quite some time, just as the Najib government held on against the Mujahideen for several years until the support of the Soviet Union disappeared, just as the Soviet Union itself disappeared. That was the decisive factor. And we have to be honest here. US forces are leaving, other NATO forces are leaving, but it's a very small force at this point. Training will continue, some of it outside of Afghanistan's borders. The Afghan army, though, is capable of conducting its own training now, and will continue to do so. But the crucial factor is, will the international community continue to support Afghanistan? And here, there has been absolutely no wavering. I mean, Australia is closing its embassy. Australia is a very small player in the grand scheme of things. And they came in late, and they're going, perhaps because their priorities are elsewhere. But countries like Canada are committed to continuing to spend $90 million a year in Afghanistan on the high quality projects that we have always supported. The United States and many others, including Canada, will continue to support the security forces. So the world is still behind Afghanistan, even though we are no longer fighting on Afghanistan's behalf. And that's as it should be. The vision we had was always for an Afghan army to take over responsibility for combat at the earliest possible date. What no one foresaw in 2001 or 2005 or 2010 was that 20 years later, Pakistan would still be waging proxy war, would still be supporting the Taliban massively through Directorate S, of the ISI and other state agencies. That is the danger, the threat to international security, peace and security that needs to be removed.
Thank you very much. Minister, we know we ran a little bit over the schedule, but still, before we can wrap it up, you can have some final words and thoughts about the future from here, where we will be in 3 months, you think? You have any idea?
Well, I think fighting will continue. Unfortunately, violence will continue. I don't hold out much hope for these conferences. But 3 months from now, it's possible, in my mind, that two things will be happening. First, this whole issue of proxy war and Pakistan's support for a proxy war in Afghanistan will have a higher profile. And will be starting to generate a level of international determination to address it that we haven't seen until now. And secondly, I think Afghanistan will become one of the conflicts in the world today that people see as a threat to the international system. You know, proxy war, Afghanistan is the victim of the original proxy war. You know, it's been going on for 40 years, but as you and I both know, invaders with British sponsorship and Mughal sponsorship have been active in Afghanistan for 200 years or more. And there was a Northwest frontier policy starting in the early 19th century that really is at the root of this proxy war. But proxy war in Afghanistan is a threat not just to one country, but to the region and the world, because it has been a breeding ground for extremism and terrorism. It's also a threat because it's a precedent for the proxy wars that Iran is still fighting in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Gaza. And the longer these proxy wars go unaddressed, the more they are a precedent for countries like Russia and China, who would love to take over more territory and get away with it. Countries that believe in law, international law, believe in democracy, really need to be much tougher on all of those states that are pursuing proxy war. And there are many, many political steps we can take to isolate them, to enact sanctions that we haven't yet taken. So I think that broader discussion about threats to international peace and security and the proxy wars that are underway today will be have a higher profile in 3 months. And I think Pakistan's proxy war in Afghanistan is not going to go away as a theme for a high-level discussion. And in 3 months, by 3 months hence, maybe we can talk again. I hope we will start to see action, not just recognition and analytical progress, but actual action to ensure that this ends. Because you know, wars look like forever wars, and they look endless and inevitable until they end. The natural state of humanity is not to be at war; it is to live in peace. And there's no people in the world that deserves peace more than the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chris Alexander, former UN Deputy Commissioner in Afghanistan, former Canadian Ambassador to Kabul, and former Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Canada. Thank you for your time, and thank you, dear viewers, for listening and watching Lumit 24 TV with me, Hakeem Nazim, and my colleague, Nasir Khalid. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Hakeem.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chris. تشکر جناب انجینیر